So this is part 3 of the introductory lecture, and I just want to say something about the way I've put together the module, and hopefully it'll become clear how the themes in the module and how the structure for the short and the long sessions and the assignments all kind of connect with what I've been talking about in the first and second parts of this introductory lecture. So this is a fairly short chunk of film compared to the first two bits, so we'll press on. I just want to first of all say something about the long sessions. Now, in the first two parts of this lecture we talked about the discipline of history, and in the second part I talked about the different traditions in history education in schools. Here's where it becomes clear that what I'm really focusing on here is the tradition within schools which promotes disciplinary history. And through the module it should become clear of why that is, and I hinted at it in the second part of the lecture, which is just to say that whatever school history is that promotes single national narratives, it's not really the intellectual pursuit of history as a discipline. And therefore I think there's little we could say on a history methods course about promoting that. I mean, it's just about efficiency of transmission. What I'd be hoping is that even if you're in a system which has a single sponsored textbook and you're in a fairly tightly controlled curriculum, that you would be able to use your time in the history classroom with students to promote a level of engagement with the academic nature of history, and to promote a level of criticality as young people engage with history as a construct, so that you could begin to bring some of those disciplinary perspectives to bear in your classroom. So I don't want to assume that this is all completely in line with the curriculum structures that you're working within, because they will provide very real constraints, but I do want to promote this as the only really genuine approach to critical personal learning that we should be endeavouring to pursue through a history methods course on a PGCE. So these long sessions really pick up the themes that we've established in the first two parts of the introductory lecture. In the first session next time I'm going to focus on chronology, causation and significance. So we've already talked a little bit about significance, and I'm just going to talk about how we construct a sense of time and change over time, how we begin to engage children in thinking in rigorous and methodical ways about the nature of causation and what it means to make a claim that one thing caused another, or something happened because of a number of other factors. When we're doing that, we construct a very specific kind of account of something in history, a very particular kind of explanation. And then finally we'll say something about the nature of historical significance, and in particular in that session I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say something is significant. So what are the characteristics which lead one to judge something as significant? In the second long session after that I'm going to focus on evidence in inquiry. It's clear from what I've said about disciplinary history that that's absolutely at the core of disciplinary history, and so we'll look at what historians do with sources of information and how they make sense of them within the context of particular historical inquiries, and then what we can learn from that to bring to bear in the history classroom, the kinds of teaching approaches that have developed around the world to promote that dimension to historical reasoning. The next one is a bit more controversial. I want to talk about empathy and imagination. Now, some people have rejected historical empathy as a bit of an anachronism and have said that actually because the distinction between people in the past, especially the distant past, and our current kind of way of seeing ourselves in the world is so great, then historical empathy is at best a bit woolly and a bit vague, and probably not really very easy to grasp or to achieve, and at worst it dilutes the rigour of the academic discipline of history. But I want to argue that really empathy is important to the extent that we need to understand people in their times. And so when I talk about historical empathy, I'll be developing that notion of really contextual understanding, and of how we can work with children to move them beyond simplistic notions that people in the past were just odd or inexplicable, because they did things that to us seem unimaginable or just difficult to understand their motivations. So it's important, I think, to look at that. We'll look at some examples of research that have attempted to unpick what's going on when children attempt to engage with people's motivations in the past, and we'll begin then to think about some of the strategies teachers can employ to make sure that we're engaging with the notion of historical empathy in a slightly more rigorous way. And then finally, I'll say something about interpretation and narrative. Again, the theme of narrative cropped up in the first part of the lecture, and this is important in two senses really. Interpretation is important because we need to interpret the evidence that's in front of us, but it's also important because it's in constructing interpretations that we make our historical inquiries available to other people. And it also means that in the history classroom, other historians' interpretations of events are open to critique and analysis. And so one of the ways in which we might do this in a very simple way is to think about textbooks as the construction of a particular narrative or a particular interpretation, and use that as a teaching resource, so that even if you are teaching in a classroom where you're required to use a certain textbook, we can begin to problematize that text as a deliberately constructed and partial account of history, and begin to use that as a teachable moment and a teaching resource. And so we'll start to tease apart what people do when they construct interpretations, how we judge interpretations, how we judge them as fit for particular purposes, and how we relate them to particular context. So in this first set of long sessions, we're going to take some time to really kind of unpick some of those big ideas we briefly touched on today, and think about how they relate to how children learn history and what teachers are doing in history classrooms. The short sessions are a bit more focused on the practicalities of working in the classroom. So a couple of sessions looking at assessment and impact, and there I just really want to flag up fairly early on, in terms of the practical dimensions of teaching, how you know you're securing learning, and I want to use that to set up some assignments as well. So most of the input that I'm giving you is on history teaching, but obviously the point of history teaching is to secure quality history learning in the students. So I just want to have a couple of sessions where we talk about that, and we talk about how teachers measure impact and how we account for impact in learning. Games and simulations and sites and objects are obviously very practical ways to engage students with different types of activities, where we might engage with evidence and we might construct interpretations. So those are just some distinctive, it seems to me, pedagogical strategies that history teachers in particular would be using when they're constructing their teaching plans and sequences. Then I've put debating history and textbooks together because I think they're particularly useful for thinking about interpretations and narrative. And so we'll look at using using debating in the history classroom, and then we'll look at using and constructing possibly textbooks as ways of exploring this whole notion of multiple narratives and multiple interpretations around the same events. And then finally we'll end with talking about how we might pull some of these ideas together, particularly to think about teaching sensitive and controversial issues. And clearly this is one of the most interesting and fruitful areas of history learning that we can engage in. And so we'll talk about some of the principles and some of the practical strategies for making sure that when you open up these controversial areas in the history classroom, that you can do something fruitful with that, rather than just unlock a load of angst and anxiety and uncertainty. So, as you know, this part of the course has 3 assignments. Assignment 1 you've already been given, and everyone on the course has been given the same assignment 1, which is to look at the role of active learning in relation to your subject specialism. I'm going to follow that up with assignment 2 and ask you to pursue this interest in active learning and give me an example of an active learning strategy that you have devised and developed in the classroom, and to show me how you know that has worked as a learning strategy. So it's great that we're using active learning strategies in the classroom. It makes the teaching interesting, hopefully it makes it engaging for the children, but the most important rationale for this kind of approach is that it secures quality learning. And so I want you just to kind of link assignments 1 and 2 together. You make the general case for active learning in history in part 1, and then you'll pursue some specific strategies in part 2 to convince yourself and me that you can use those strategies effectively to help children learn history. And then finally, I'm going to pursue that theme in assignment 3 as well, and ask you to pick one student in one class and to collect some examples of work over time to demonstrate to me that they are making progression in the history that they're learning. But crucially there, I want you to be able to use the language of the long and the short session. So I want you to be able to use some of those big conceptual ideas about evidence or empathy or causation or significance, whichever is relevant to the kind of scheme of work that you're teaching. But I want you to be able to account for children's progress, not just in the pulling together of more and more facts, a bigger body of knowledge, but in a deeper conceptual understanding they can use to explain the historical events that you're looking at. So it's really important, I think, although we'll be going through this on a week-by-week basis, that in your mind you have some sense of how these things connect together. So the long sessions are really about exploring that deeper structure of the subject, focusing on disciplinary history and beginning to think about some of the practical implications. The short sessions are much more thoroughly focused on the practical implications, and we'll be exploring a range of pedagogic strategies that you can use in the history classroom and beginning to think about how we make sure that they connect to really deep learning in history. And then the assignments are largely focused on making sure that you know that you are securing that learning and that that learning is taking place in relation to the deeper structures, as well as just learning facts accurately as you proceed through the scheme of work. So that's where we're heading in the module. That's all I really wanted to say in terms of the overview. And in the final short lecture, or the short section of this introductory lecture, I'm going to share some thoughts about the reading that I've asked you to do and just remind you of some of the tasks that you'll be doing for this first week.